The Fiction Writer and His Country, Flannery O'Connor. Among the many complaints made about the modern American novelist, the loudest, if not the most intelligent, has been the charge that he is not speaking for his country. A few seasons back, an editorial in Life magazine asked grandly, "Who speaks for America today?" and was not able to conclude that our novelists, or at least our most gifted ones, did. The gist of the editorial was that in the last 10 years this country had enjoyed an unparalleled prosperity, that it had come nearer to producing a classless society than any other nation, and that it was the most powerful country in the world, but our novelists were writing as if they lived in packing boxes on the edge of the dump while they awaited admission to the poorhouse. Instead of this, the editorial requested that they give us something that really represented this country, and it ended with a very smooth and sleek shift into a higher key and demanded further that the novelists show us the redeeming quality of spiritual purpose, for it said that what is most missing from our hothouse literature is the joy of life itself. This was irritating enough to provoke answers from many novelists and critics, but I do not know that any of those who answered considered the question specifically from the standpoint of the novelist with Christian concerns, who, presumably, would have an interest at least equal to the editors of Life in the redeeming quality of spiritual purpose. What is such a writer going to take his country to be? The word usually used by literary folk in this connection would be world, but the word country will do. In fact, being homely, it will do better, for it suggests more. It suggests everything from the actual countryside that the novelist describes, on, to, and through the peculiar characteristics of his region and his nation, and on, through, and under all of these to his true country, which the writer with Christian convictions will consider to be what is eternal and absolute. This covers considerable territory, and if one were talking on any other kind of writing than the writing of fiction, one would perhaps have to say countries. But it is the peculiar burden of the fiction writer that he has to make one country do for all, and that he has to evoke that one country through the concrete particulars of a life that he can make believable. This is first of all a matter of vocation, and a vocation is a limiting factor which extends even to the kind of material that the writer is able to apprehend imaginatively. The writer can choose what he writes about, but he can't choose what he is able to make live. And so far as he is concerned, a living deformed character is acceptable, and a dead whole one is not. The Christian writer, particularly, will feel that whatever his initial gift is, it comes from God. And no matter how minor a gift it is, he will not be willing to destroy it, but trying to use it outside its proper limits. The country that the writer is concerned with in the most objective way is, of course, the region that the most immediately surrounds him, or simply the country, with its body of manners, that he knows well enough to employ. It's generally suggested that the Southern writer has some advantage here. Most readers these days must be sufficiently sick of hearing about Southern writers and Southern writing and what so many reviewers insist upon calling the Southern School. No one has ever made plain just what the Southern School is or which writers belong to it. Sometimes, when it is most respectable, it seems to mean the little group of agrarians that flourished at Vanderbilt in the 20s. But more often, the term conjures up an image of Gothic monstrosities and the idea of a preoccupation with everything, deformed and grotesque. Most of us are considered, I believe, to be unhappy combinations of Poe and Erskine Caldwell. At least, however, we are all known to be anguished. The writers of the editorial in question suggest that our anguish is a result of our isolation from the rest of the country. I feel that this would be news to most Southern writers. The anguish that most of us have observed for some time now has been caused not by the fact that the South is alienated from the rest of the country, but by the fact that it is not alienated enough, that every day we are getting more and more like the rest of the country, that we are being forced out, not only of our many sins, but of our few virtues. This may be unholy anguish, but it is anguish nevertheless. Manners are of such great consequence to the novelist than any kind will do. Bad manners are better than no manners at all, and because we are losing our customary manners, we are probably overly conscious of them. This seems to be a condition that produces writers. In the South there are more amateur authors than there are rivers and streams. In almost every hamlet you'll find at least one lady writing epics in Negro dialect, and probably 2 or 3 old gentlemen who have impossible historical novels on the way. The woods are full of regional writers, and it is the great horror of every serious Southern writer that he will become one of them. The writer himself will probably feel that the only way for him to keep from becoming one of them is to examine his conscience and to observe our fierce but fading manners in the light of an ultimate concern. Others would say that the way to escape being a regional writer is to widen region. Don't be a Southern writer, be an American writer. Express this great country, which is enjoying an unparalleled prosperity, which is the strongest nation in the world, and which has almost produced a classless society. How, with all this prosperity and strength and classlessness staring you in the face, can you honestly produce a literature which doesn't make plain the joy of life? The writer whose position is Christian, and probably also the writer whose position is not, will begin to wonder at this point if there could not be some ugly correlation between our unparalleled prosperity and the stridency of these demands for a literature that shows us the joy of life. He may at least be permitted to ask if these screams for joy would be quite so piercing if joy were really more abundant in our prosperous society. The Christian writer will feel that in the greatest depth of vision, moral judgment will be implicit, and that when we are invited to represent the country according to survey, what we are asked to do is to separate mystery from manners and judgment from vision, in order to produce something a little more palatable to the modern temper. We are asked to form our consciences in the light of statistics, which is to establish the relative as absolute. For many, this may be a convenience, since we don't live in an age of settled belief. But it cannot be a convenience, it cannot even be possible for the writer who is a Catholic. He will feel that any long-continued service to it will produce a soggy, formless, and sentimental literature, one that will provide a sense of spiritual purpose for those who connect the spirit with romanticism, and a sense of joy for those who confuse that virtue with satisfaction. The storyteller is concerned with what is. But if what is what can be determined by survey, then the disciples of Dr. Kinsey and Dr. Gallop are sufficient for the day thereof. In the greatest fiction, the writer's moral sense coincides with his dramatic sense, and I see no way for it to do this unless his moral judgment is part of the very act of seeing, and he is free to use it. I have heard it said that belief in Christian dogma is a hindrance to the writer, but I myself have found nothing further from the truth. Actually, it frees the storyteller to observe. It is not a set of rules which fixes what he sees in the world. It affects his writing primarily by guaranteeing his respect for mystery. In the introduction to a collection of his stories called Rotting Hill, Wyndham Lewis has written, "If I write about a hill that is rotting, it is because I despise rot." The general accusation passed against writers now is that they write about rot because they love it. Some do, and their works may betray them, but it is impossible not to believe that some write about rot because they see it and recognize it for what it is. It may well be asked, however, why so much of our literature is apparently lacking in a sense of spiritual purpose and in the joy of life, and if stories lacking such are actually credible. The only conscience I have to examine in this matter is my own. And when I look at stories I have written, I find that they are, for the most part, about people who are poor, who are afflicted in both mind and body, who have little, or at best a distorted sense of spiritual purpose, and whose actions do not apparently give the reader a great assurance of the joy of life. Yet, how is this? For am I no disbeliever in spiritual purpose and no vague believer? I see from the standpoint of Christian orthodoxy. This means that for me, the meaning of life is centered in our redemption by Christ, and that what I see in the world, I see in its relation to that. I don't think that this is a position that can be taken halfway, or one that it is particularly easy in these times to make transparent in fiction. Some may blame preoccupation with the grotesque on the fact that here we have a Southern writer and that this is just the type of imagination that Southern life fosters. I have written several stories which did not seem to me to have any grotesque characters in them at all, but which have immediately been labeled grotesque by known Southern readers. I find it hard to believe that what is observable behavior in one section can be entirely without parallel in another. At least, of late, Southern writers have had the opportunity of pointing out that none of us invented Elvis Presley, and that youth is himself probably less an occasion for concern than his popularity, which is not restricted to the southern part of the country. The problem may well become one of finding something that is not grotesque and of deciding what standards we would use in looking. My own feeling is that writers who see by the light of their Christian faith will have, in these times, the sharpest eyes for the grotesque, for the perverse, and for the unacceptable. In some cases, these writers may be unconsciously infected with the Manichaean spirit of the times and suffer the much discussed disjunction between sensibility and belief. But I think that more often the reason for this attention to the perverse is the difference between their beliefs and the beliefs of their audience. Redemption is meaningless unless there is cause for it in the actual life we have. And for the last few centuries, there has been operating in our culture the secular belief that there is no such cause. The novelist with Christian concerns will find in modern life distortions which are repugnant to him, and his problem will be to make these appear as distortions to an audience which is used to seeing them as natural. And he may well be forced to take ever more violent means to get his vision across to his hostile audience. When you can assume that your audience holds the same beliefs you do, you can relax a little and use more normal ways of talking to it. When you have to assume that it does not, then you have to make your vision apparent by shock. To the hard of hearing you shout, and for the almost blind you draw large and startling figures. Unless we are willing to accept our artists as they are, the answer to the question, who speaks for America today, will have to be the advertising agencies. They are entirely capable of showing us our unparalleled prosperity and our almost classless society, and no one has ever accused them of not being affirmative. Where the artist is still trusted, he will not be looked to for assurance. Those who believe that art proceeds from a healthy and not from a diseased faculty of the mind will take that he shows them as a revelation, not of what we ought to be, but of what we are at a given time and under given circumstances. That is, as a limited revelation, but a revelation nevertheless. When we talk about the writer's country, we are liable to forget that no matter what particular country it is inside as well as outside him. Art requires a delicate adjustment of the outer and inner worlds in such a way that, without changing their nature, they can be seen through each other. To know oneself is to know one's region. It is also to know the world, and it is also, paradoxically, a form of exile from that world. The writer's value is lost, both to himself and to his country, as soon as he ceases to see that country as a part of himself, and to know oneself is, above all, to know what one lacks. It is to measure oneself against truth, and not the other way around. The first product of self-knowledge is humility, and this is not a virtue conspicuous in any national character. St. Cyril of Jerusalem, instructing catechumens, wrote, "The dragon sits by the side of the road, watching those who pass. Beware lest he devour you. We go to the Father of souls, but it is necessary to pass by the dragon. No matter what form the dragon may take, it is of this mysterious passage past him, or into his jaws, that stories of any depth will always be concerned to tell, and this being the case, it requires considerable courage at any time, in any country, not to turn away from the storyteller."